The cosmos burned in the age before memory. Elemental chaos churned without form or purpose, an infinite storm of raw potential that knew neither beginning nor end. Then came the primordial titans, beings of such colossal scale that their footsteps carved valleys into the formless void, and their breath cooled molten stone into the first stable ground. The titans shaped the raw chaos with brutal efficiency. They seized fire and compressed it into cores of volcanic heat. They gathered water and bound it into seas that would not evaporate into nothingness. They tore solid matter from the swirling maelstrom and forged it into mountains that would not collapse back into dust. Each act of creation was an act of conquest, imposing order upon a universe that fought against permanence with every molecule of its being. The material plane emerged from their labors not as a gift, but as a battlefield prize, won through millennia of struggle during what would later be named the Dawn War. The gods descended from the astral sea to claim what the titans had built. Divine powers clashed with primordial forces across landscapes still cooling from their creation. Mountains shattered under the weight of immortal combat. Oceans boiled away and reformed in new configurations. The war raged without pause or mercy, neither side willing to surrender territories they believed rightfully theirs. Corellon Larethian met Groom-Shwan-I in single combat atop a crystalline plateau suspended in the astral sea itself. The elven deity wielded a blade forged from starlight, while the orcish god swung an iron spear that had tasted the blood of a dozen primordials. They fought for 7 days without rest. On the 8th day, Corellon's sword found its mark and tore through Grumsh's left eye, splitting it open and sending divine ichor spraying across the boundaries between planes. The blood did not dissipate. Divine essence possessed properties that mortal matter could never replicate. Where Grumsh's blood struck the edges of reality, it crystallized into droplets of frozen divinity that hung suspended between worlds. Each droplet contained the fundamental nature of godhood itself, concentrated power that would not fade or diminish with time. These crystallized fragments became seeds, anchoring points where new forms of reality could take root. Reality began to fracture. The material plane had been forged as a single unified creation, one layer of existence imposed upon the chaos. But the presence of divine blood altered the fundamental rules governing planar boundaries. The material plane started generating echoes of itself, phantom copies that existed alongside the original but separated by the thinnest of veils. These echoes were not perfect duplicates but distorted reflections, as if reality itself had been held up to a warped mirror that emphasized certain qualities while diminishing others. 2 primary echoes stabilized from among the many that flickered into brief existence. One reflected the material plane through the lens of shadow and entropy, draining color and warmth until only cold and darkness remained. The other reflection moved in the opposite direction, amplifying every living thing and saturating the landscape with such concentrated vitality that the very air shimmered with magical potential. The first would become the Shadowfell. The second coalesced into the Feywild. The Feywild took shape over centuries rather than moments. It mirrored every mountain range of the material plane, but rendered those peaks in impossible colors that shifted with the observer's emotions. It replicated every forest but grew those trees to heights that defied natural law, their branches interweaving into canopies that blocked out the sky. Rivers flowed in both directions simultaneously. Flowers bloomed and withered and bloomed again in cycles measured in heartbeats rather than seasons. The plane existed in a state of perpetual heightening, taking everything the material plane contained and amplifying it beyond mortal tolerance. Magic saturated the Feywild from its inception. The plane did not simply contain arcane energy but was constructed from it, woven into the fabric of its existence at the most fundamental level. Where the material plane required wizards to carefully extract and shape magical forces through study and discipline, the Feywild offered power freely to anything that existed within its boundaries. Every stone held enchantment, every breeze carried transformative potential. The plane rejected the material world's distinction between magical and mundane, recognizing only gradations of supernatural intensity. The first Fey creatures emerged from this concentrated magic without divine intervention or mortal ancestry. They simply began to exist wherever magical saturation reached critical thresholds. Pools of liquid arcane energy gave birth to water sprites who possessed no memories of creation but understood, instinctively, how to shape their home waters into weapons or shields. Groves where 6 different types of magic intersected produced dryads who were simultaneously tree and woman, neither one nor the other but an entirely new form of life. These spontaneous births occurred by the thousands, populating the empty Feywild with beings who belonged nowhere else. The natural order recognized no hierarchy among these early Fey. They existed as equals in a realm that had no concept of civilization or governance. Pixies claimed territories measured in square yards around their favorite flowers. Treants spread roots across miles of virgin forest. Neither acknowledged the other's existence except when their interests directly confided. The Feywild in its infancy was a place of anarchic beauty where every creature pursued its own desires without consideration for consequences or cooperation. Dragons discovered the Feywild before any humanoid race set foot within its borders. Ancient Wyrms, flying through the space between planes, found thin spots in reality where determined effort could tear through into the new realm. They passed through these rifts and found landscapes richer than anything the material plane offered. The ambient magic strengthened their already formidable powers. The chaotic nature of time meant they could hoard treasures for centuries, while only days passed in the world beyond. The dragons established territorial claims through the oldest law known to their kind. They fought. Great worms clashed in aerial battles that reshaped valleys and burned entire forests to ash that sprouted again within hours. The victors claimed the choicest territories, establishing lairs in locations where magical convergence reached its highest intensity. They began to accumulate hoards not just of gold and gems but of pure crystallized magic, artifacts that had formed naturally from the plane's concentrated arcane saturation. The defeated either fled back to the material plane or accepted subservient positions in the territories of their conquerors. The Fey reacted to draconic invasion with confusion rather than coordinated resistance. Individual pixies harassed dragons with illusions and mischief. Treants defended their specific groves with sudden violence. But no unified response emerged because no unified Fey society existed to organize one. The dragons faced thousands of minor annoyances rather than any genuine military opposition. They tolerated the Fey as they would tolerate particularly clever vermin, dangerous when encountered unexpectedly, but incapable of threatening true draconic dominance. The Seldarine turned their attention to the Feywild after securing victory in the Dawn War. The Elven Pantheon recognized immediately that this plane of heightened emotion and artistic beauty aligned perfectly with their divine portfolios. Corellon Larethian walked the Feywild's forests and found them more beautiful than anything in the material plane. Sehanine, Moonbow, danced beneath the eternal twilight and declared the realm sacred to her mysteries. The gods did not create the Feywild, but they claimed it nonetheless, asserting divine authority over a plane that had emerged from the chaos without their direct involvement. The Seldarine began to actively shape portions of the Feywild according to their aesthetic preferences and divine will. Corellon designated certain groves as holy sites and infused them with power drawn from the astral sea. Sehanine crafted moonlit glades where the boundaries between waking and dreaming grew thin enough to step through. Erevan Ilisere scattered fragments of pure chaos across the landscape, creating zones where reality operated according to different rules every hour. The gods worked as artists rather than architects, emphasizing beauty and meaning over functionality or consistency. Morwell, the Queen of Stars, descended from the celestial realms in the wake of the Seldarine's blessing. She was not a god, but something else entirely, a being of pure law and celestial radiance who had observed the Feywild's emergence with growing interest. She passed through the upper planes and entered the Feywild at its highest point, where the barriers between realms grew thin enough that celestial light could penetrate directly through. The Queen of Stars established the Court of Stars upon a mountain peak that existed simultaneously in 3 planes. Her palace crystallized from solidified moonlight and starfire, a structure of impossible geometry that mortal eyes could observe but never fully comprehend. She gathered celestial servants and recruited the most beautiful and lawful of the Fey creatures, offering them purpose and structure in exchange for their service. The Court of Stars became the first organized Fey society, imposing celestial hierarchy upon a realm that had previously known only chaos. Morwell's influence spread slowly but inexorably. She sent envoys to powerful Fey across the plane, offering alliance and protection. Many refused, preferring their anarchic freedom to any form of governance. But others accepted, recognizing that organization provided strength against draconic predators and the growing influence of darker powers. The Court of Stars never achieved dominion over the entire Feywild, but established itself as a legitimate force that could not be ignored or dismissed. The plane's relationship with time revealed itself through catastrophe. A great red dragon named Pyrothraxus established his lair in a volcanic caldera and spent what he perceived as a single night arranging his horde into an aesthetically pleasing configuration. He departed at dawn to hunt in the material plane and returned 12 hours later to find his lair transformed. The volcanic caldera had eroded into a gentle valley. His carefully arranged horde lay scattered and buried beneath 3,000 years of accumulated sediment. Trees grew through his treasure piles. A tribe of pixies had established a village in what had been his sleeping chamber. Pyrothraxus's rage shook the Feywild for miles. He incinerated the pixie village and spent decades excavating his scattered horde, but the damage was done. The dragons collectively realized that the Feywild's temporal instability made it fundamentally unsuitable for long-term habitation. They could visit and hunt and gather magical treasures, but maintaining permanent lairs meant risking exactly what Pyrothraxus had experienced. Many dragons abandoned their Feywild territories entirely. Those who remained learned to anchor their lairs with powerful magic that enforced consistent time flow. But such enchantments required constant maintenance and could fail without warning. Titania and Oberon emerged from the deepest primeval forests during the age when dragons retreated and celestial powers advanced. They were neither gods nor mortals nor simple Fey. The forests birthed them fully formed from concentrated nature magic, giving them power that rivaled lesser deities from the moment of their creation. Titania embodied summer and growth, her presence causing flowers to bloom and trees to grow at accelerated rates. Oberon represented the wild hunt and primal ferocity, his footsteps leaving behind tracks that animals would follow for generations. They claimed dominion through demonstration rather than conquest. Titania walked through contested territories, and the land itself responded to her will, recognizing her as its rightful sovereign. Oberon called the beasts of the forest, and they came, acknowledging him as their king without question or hesitation. Other Fey looked upon these beings and understood instinctively that something fundamental had shifted in the Feywild's power structure. Neither Titania nor Oberon challenged the Court of Stars directly. They represented different aspects of Fey nature, one celestial and lawful, while the others embodied pure wild magic. The Queen of Stars governed through hierarchy and duty. Titania and Oberon ruled through the consent of the natural world itself. The two powers circled each other warily, establishing separate spheres of influence that would not intersect for centuries. The first recorded planar crossing occurred during a harvest moon, when the barriers between worlds grew thin. A tribe of primitive elves dwelling in the material plane's northern forests pursued a white stag through a moonlit grove. The stag vanished between 2 ancient oaks. The hunters followed without hesitation and found themselves somewhere impossible. The sky blazed with colors that had no names. The trees reached heights that defied every principle of natural growth. Time flowed in rhythms they could not predict or understand. The elves panicked. They tried to return through the grove but found only more forest stretching endlessly in every direction. They wandered for what felt like hours and discovered they had aged 10 years. They rested for what they thought was a single night and woke to find only minutes had passed. The Feywild had claimed them, and like everything else that entered the plane, they would be transformed by the experience. The age of isolation was ending. The elves who stumbled into the Feywild during that first harvest moon crossing never returned to their tribes. They wandered the impossible forests for months that stretched into years, their bodies changing with every sunrise that came too quickly or too slowly. Their skin took on luminescent qualities, glowing faintly in darkness. Their eyes shifted through colors that matched their emotional states. The Feywild was remaking them at a fundamental level, transforming mortal flesh into something that could survive in a realm where reality itself remained perpetually unstable. Other tribes followed over the centuries. Some entered through accident, chasing prey or fleeing enemies into groves they did not recognize as threshold spaces. Others discovered the thin places, deliberately, drawn by legends of the first vanished hunters and consumed by curiosity about what lay beyond. Each crossing added to the population of displaced elves struggling to comprehend their new home. They formed scattered communities in clearings and valleys, building shelters from living wood that grew according to their needs, and establishing territories they could defend against the Fey creatures who viewed them as intruders. The proto-elven tribes dwelling along the material plane's northern forests began experiencing transformations even before they crossed into the Feywild proper. Generations of exposure to locations where planar boundaries bled together changed them gradually but inexorably. Children were born with unusual eye colors that shifted between purple and gold. Adults discovered they could see perfectly in near darkness. Entire families reported dreams that felt more real than waking life, visions of forests that existed in impossible configurations. The elves were becoming something other than purely mortal through prolonged contact with a realm that rejected the material plane's rigid laws. Scholars in later ages would debate whether these changes resulted from environmental exposure or represented early stages of divine transformation. The elves themselves possessed no framework to understand what was happening to them. They knew only that their people were different from other mortal races, blessed or cursed with qualities that set them apart. Some tribes celebrated these changes as gifts from the gods. Others feared them as corruption that would eventually destroy their humanity. The disagreements sparked conflicts that would echo through millennia of elven history. Corellon Larathian watched the transformation of the northern tribes and made a decision that would reshape elven civilization forever. The god opened permanent gates between the material plane and Feywild at 7 sacred locations scattered across the northern forests. Each gate manifested as a standing stone circle that blazed with divine radiance during the full moon. Corellon spoke directly to the tribal leaders through visions and omens, offering an invitation that was simultaneously a test and a blessing. The elves could pass through these gates and abandon their mortal existence entirely, embracing transformation into beings of pure magic and emotion. The invitation divided every tribe that heard it. Conservative elders argued for maintaining their connection to the material plane, fearing that acceptance would cost them their essential nature. They pointed to the stories of those who had vanished into the Feywild and never returned, cautioning that the same fate awaited any who accepted Corellon's offer. Younger members countered that the god was offering transcendence, an opportunity to become something greater than mortal limitations allowed. The debates consumed entire seasons, splitting families and destroying friendships. The first tribe passed through Corellon's gates during the winter solstice of a year that would be remembered as the beginning of the Great Crossing. 300 elves walked through the standing stones and emerged into the Feywild fundamentally altered. Their transformation occurred instantly rather than gradually, divine magic accelerating changes that would have taken generations through natural exposure. They became taller and more slender, their features sharpening into angles that suggested geometry more than biology. Their eyes blazed with internal light. Magic flowed through them as naturally as blood, responding to their emotions and desires without conscious effort. These transformed elves gave themselves a new name. They were Eledrin, neither fully mortal nor completely fey, but something unprecedented in the cosmos. They possessed the longevity and magical affinity of Fey creatures, while retaining the capacity for growth and change that defined mortal races. They could shape reality through will and emotion, but remained vulnerable to death through violence or misfortune. They represented a bridge between worlds, beings who belonged equally to neither the material plane nor the Feywild, but stood apart from both. The Great Crossing continued for 7 centuries. Tens of thousands of elves passed through Corellan's gates during this period, abandoning mortal existence to join the Eladrin in the Feywild. Entire tribes departed the material plane in single mass migrations, leaving behind empty villages and bewildered neighbors. Other tribes sent only their youngest members, hoping to preserve some connection to their ancestral lands while still claiming the benefits of transformation. A few tribes refused entirely, sealing their sacred groves against the gates and declaring that true elves would remain forever in the world of their birth. The Eladrin established their first permanent settlement at a location where 3 major ley lines intersected beneath a floating island. They named it Astrazalian, the City of Starlight, and built it according to principles that blended material plane architecture with Feywild impossibility. The foundations rested on solid ground, but the upper towers floated freely in the air, connected by bridges of solidified moonlight that appeared and vanished with the phases of the moon. The city existed simultaneously in both planes, phasing between them with the changing seasons, so that residents could maintain connections to both worlds. Astrazalian's unique nature made it a center of Eladrin culture from its founding. Merchants from the material plane could visit during specific seasons to trade goods impossible to acquire elsewhere. Fey creatures entered during other seasons to bargain with Eladrin, who understood both mortal commerce and Fey hospitality. The city accumulated wealth rapidly, its markets filled with dragon hordes, crystallized magic from the Feywild's depths, and mundane materials from the material plane that possessed unusual value in a realm where everything was already magical. The city also became a center of political power. Eladrin nobles established courts within Astrazalian's floating towers, each competing for influence and prestige. They formed alliances through marriage and magic, creating dynasties that would endure for thousands of years. The noble houses developed elaborate protocols governing everything from diplomatic correspondence to the proper methods for challenging rivals to duels. These traditions would eventually spread to Eladrin communities across the Feywild, establishing cultural foundations that persisted even after political unity collapsed. Senaliese rose 300 years after Astrazalian's founding. Where the first city emphasized connection between planes, Senaliese celebrated pure Eladrin achievement and explicitly rejected mortal influence. Its founders built the metropolis entirely from living crystal grown through collaborative magic. Involving hundreds of Eladrin working in perfect coordination, the crystal responded to emotional states of nearby inhabitants, shifting colors and opacity to reflect the city's collective mood. During celebrations, the entire city blazed with golden light. During periods of mourning, it dimmed to near transparency. The crystal responded to individual emotions as well as collective ones. An Eladrin walking through Senliese's streets left a trail of color shifts in nearby walls, creating patterns that faded slowly over hours. Skilled observers could read these patterns like text, interpreting emotional histories from the chromatic traces. The practice evolved into an art form unique to Senaliese, with specialists trained to analyze color patterns and provide insights into psychological states and social dynamics. Senaliese grew to become the largest Eladrin city in the Feywild, home to over 100,000 inhabitants at its height. Its universities taught magic according to principles impossible to replicate in the material plane, where students learned to cast spells by channeling pure emotion rather than memorizing formulaic incantations. Its libraries contained knowledge accumulated from thousands of years of Eladrin exploration, mapped onto crystal tablets that could only be read by those with proper training. The city represented Eladrin civilization at its apex, demonstrating what transformation and transcendence could achieve when freed from mortal limitations. Everything was about to shatter. The Eladrin discovered their capacity for seasonal transformation through accident rather than deliberate experimentation. A young Eladrin mage named Syndra experienced catastrophic heartbreak when her lover abandoned her for a rival. The emotional trauma triggered a physical metamorphosis that no Eladrin had previously exhibited. Her hair turned white as snow, and her skin took on a pale blue tint. Ice crystals formed in the air around her. She had become a winter Eladrin, her body manifesting her emotional state as a permanent transformation rather than temporary mood. Syndra's transformation sparked immediate fascination and fear. Other Eladrin began experimenting with emotional extremes to trigger similar metamorphoses. Those who experienced profound joy transformed into spring Eladrin, their appearance taking on qualities of rebirth and renewal. Those who achieved states of passionate intensity became summer Eladrin, radiating heat and vital energy. Those who reached contemplative melancholy shifted into autumn Eladrin, their features reflecting harvest and decline. The four seasonal aspects represented different facets of Eladrin nature, allowing individuals to literally embody their dominant emotional characteristics. The seasonal transformations proved non-permanent but sticky. An Eladrin could shift between seasonal aspects through intense emotional experiences, but most found themselves gravitating toward a single aspect that matched their fundamental personality. Spring Eladrin rarely became winter Eladrin except through the most traumatic circumstances. Summer Eladrin occasionally cycled into autumn but almost never maintained that state for long. The aspects created unofficial social categories within Eladrin society, with individuals bonding over shared seasonal nature and developing cultural practices specific to each aspect. The Court of Coral established itself beneath the Mercandraw Sea after aquatic Eladrin discovered they could breathe water as easily as air. A group of Eladrin explorers dove into the Feywild's largest ocean to investigate legends of underwater ruins and found themselves transforming to survive the environment. Gills opened along their necks. Webbing grew between their fingers, their eyes adapted to perceive in near darkness. They had become Sea Eladrin, a subspecies as distinct from their surface cousins as Eladrin were from mortal elves. The Sea Eladrin established their capital in a trench so deep that light from the surface never penetrated its depths. They grew their city from coral and shells, creating structures that followed organic curves rather than geometric angles. They developed magic that manipulated water pressure and current, turning the ocean itself into a weapon against intruders. They maintained minimal contact with surface Eladrin communities, preferring isolation in their submarine realm. The Court of Coral developed entirely separate customs and political allegiances from surface Eladrin nations. They worshipped different aspects of the Seldarine, emphasizing Idro and Deep Seychelles over Corellon. They formed alliances with sea dragons and powerful water elementals rather than surface powers. They viewed themselves as the true heirs of Eladrin transformation, arguing that their adaptation demonstrated greater commitment to embracing the Feywild's possibilities than surface dwellers who still walked on solid ground. The philosophical divide would never fully heal, creating permanent splits within Eladrin civilization. Arcane magic flourished among the Eladrin in ways impossible for material plane wizards. Traditional arcane study required years of memorization and practice, slowly building understanding of how to extract magical energy from the environment and shape it into desired effects. Eladrin bypassed this entire process. They existed in a plane constructed from magic itself, surrounded by power they could channel as naturally as breathing. They learned to weave spells directly from ambient Feywild energy, creating effects that required no verbal components or material focuses. This natural magical affinity allowed Eladrin to develop entirely new schools of spellcraft. They discovered methods for binding emotions into physical form, creating weapons that struck at targets' psychological states rather than their bodies. They learned to craft illusions so perfect that reality itself struggled to reject them, forcing material plane physics to accommodate Feywild impossibilities. They developed teleportation magic that worked reliably within the Feywild, despite the plane's spatial distortions. a feat material wizards would not achieve for centuries. The Eladrin archmages who mastered these techniques became powers equivalent to minor archfey. They established personal domains within the Feywild where they could enforce their own localized laws of reality. They commanded resources and respect from both Fey creatures and Eladrin nobility. They formed colleges and academies to pass their knowledge to new generations, creating institutions that would endure even after empires crumbled. The city of Mithrendain arose as a monument to Eladrin scholarship. Its founders grew the entire metropolis from singing trees, massive organisms that recorded information in patterns of leaf growth and bark texture. Each tree contained libraries worth of knowledge encoded in its physical structure, accessible to those trained in proper reading techniques. The trees sang constantly, producing harmonies that reflected the information they contained so that scholars could search for specific topics by listening for relevant melodic patterns. Mithrendain became the primary archive of Eladrin history and learning. Scholars traveled from across the Feywild to study in its groves, spending decades learning to interpret the singing trees' complex information systems. The city accumulated copies of every major text produced by Eladrin civilization, along with extensive collections of Fey lore gathered from creatures who had existed since the plane's formation. It represented institutional memory made physical, an attempt to impose permanence on a culture existing in a realm that rejected stability. Eladrin explorers ventured beyond their settlements to map the Feywild's geography and discovered that the plane possessed no conventional edges. Expeditions that traveled for years in a single direction eventually found themselves approaching their starting point from the opposite direction, as if the plane curved back upon itself. But the geometry made no sense according to material plane mathematics. The distances did not add up correctly. The angles of approach violated basic principles of spatial relationships. The explorers documented dozens of locations where space folded in impossible configurations. Forests that appeared to be leagues apart sat adjacent to each other when approached from specific directions. Mountains that towered in the distance shrank to hills when reached directly. Rivers flowed in loops that covered the same territory multiple times before finally connecting to oceans. The Feywild's geography obeyed dream logic rather than physical law, creating a landscape that could never be fully mapped because it literally changed between observations. This spatial instability made military campaigns and territorial control almost impossible. An army could march toward an enemy city for weeks only to find themselves somehow behind their own supply lines. Borders established through treaty became meaningless when the territories they defined shifted positions relative to each other. The Eladrin learned to navigate through landmarks and magical beacons rather than conventional wayfinding, developing an entire body of lore about reliable paths through unreliable space. The first schism emerged within Eladrin society as the implications of their transformation became clear. Conservative factions argued passionately for maintaining permanent connections to the material plane through settlements like Astrazalian. They insisted that complete severance from mortality would transform Eladrin into something unrecognizable, essentially creating a new species rather than an elevated version of elven nature. They pointed to increasingly exotic transformations like Sea Eladrin as evidence that unchecked change would destroy everything that made them elven. Radical factions countered that such concerns represented failure to embrace Corellan's gift fully. They argued that maintaining ties to the material plane held Eladrin back from achieving their full potential. They demanded closure of all permanent gates and dissolution of settlements that spanned both planes. They wanted Eladrin civilization to exist purely in the Feywild, accepting whatever transformations resulted from total immersion in the plane's magic. The debate consumed Eladrin politics for generations. Noble houses split along factional lines. Cities declared themselves for one side or the other. Marriages were arranged or dissolved based on philosophical alignment. Violence remained rare, but rhetoric grew increasingly heated as both sides recognized that the fundamental nature of Eladrin identity hung in the balance. The schism would deepen over millennia until it finally exploded into catastrophe. The Age of Unity was ending before it truly began. Power in the Feywild had never belonged to the Eladrin alone. The plane birthed its own sovereigns from concentrated magic and primal emotion, beings who answered to no god and claimed authority through their fundamental connection to the realm itself. They were the Archfey, and their emergence would reshape every political structure the Eladrin had built. The courts they established would endure long after civilizations crumbled and empires fell to dust. Titania had ruled the summer forests since her emergence from the deepest woods, but she had never formalized that rule into something resembling government. She moved through her territories as a force of nature rather than a political entity, causing growth and abundance wherever she walked, but making no demands of those who benefited from her presence. That changed when she encountered resistance from an alliance of green lords who claimed that forests belonged to themselves rather than any single sovereign, regardless of how powerful. The Queen of Summer called a gathering at the Flourishing Grove, a valley where every known species of flower bloomed simultaneously in defiance of normal seasonal patterns. She invited every powerful Fey creature within 1,000 miles, offering safe passage and promising that those who attended would witness the birth of something unprecedented. Thousands came out of curiosity or political calculation. They filled the valley and surrounding hills, creating an assembly that represented every faction and philosophy in the southern Feywild. Titania spoke for 3 days without pause. She outlined a vision of structured rulership that would bring order to chaos while preserving the essential wildness that defined Fey nature. She proposed the Summer Court as a formal institution with codified laws, clear hierarchies, and diplomatic protocols. She promised that those who swore allegiance would receive protection and advancement, while those who refused would face neither punishment nor persecution. She was offering partnership rather than demanding submission, a fundamentally different approach than any Archfey had attempted previously. The response divided along predictable lines. Younger Fey seeking advancement and structure flocked to Titania's banner immediately. Ancient creatures who had existed since the plane's formation rejected any form of governance as contrary to Fey nature. The middle ground proved most interesting, with powerful Fey calculating whether formal court membership offered sufficient benefits to justify surrendering complete independence. Titania spent months negotiating with these fence-sitters, offering customized arrangements that addressed individual concerns while maintaining the court's overall structure. The Summer Court crystallized into existence with Titania's formal coronation during the height of summer, when the sun blazed hottest and life reached its most intense expression. She manifested a crown from woven sunlight and living roses, an artifact of such power that it could never be removed or destroyed without killing its wearer. She established the Flourishing Grove as her permanent capital and began construction of a palace grown from a single massive oak tree that expanded according to her needs. The court attracted hundreds of lesser Fey who took formal positions as knights, advisors, entertainers, and servants. Power recognized power. The Queen of Air and Darkness had served as Titania's closest companion since before the Summer Court's formation. She was a being of terrible beauty who commanded shadows and winter winds, complementing Titania's summer radiance with her own darker majesty. The two had been inseparable for centuries, sharing territories and making decisions through consensus. That partnership shattered in a single night of betrayal that would poison Fey politics for millennia. The exact nature of the betrayal remained disputed even among those who witnessed its aftermath. Some claimed the Queen of Air and Darkness discovered Titania in an intimate embrace with the Dark Lady's chosen consort, a violation of trust that could never be forgiven. Others insisted the betrayal ran deeper, involving broken oaths and stolen power rather than mere infidelity. A third version suggested the schism was inevitable, two powers of opposing nature forced apart by fundamental incompatibility. The truth died with those directly involved, leaving only consequences. The Queen of Air and Darkness fled the Summer Court with a third of its membership following her into exile. She traveled north into territories where summer's touch barely reached, establishing her own capital in a fortress of black ice and frozen shadows. She named it the Gloaming Court and declared herself sovereign of all unseelie Fae, those creatures who embodied darker aspects of Fae nature. Where Titania represented growth and joy, the Dark Queen commanded decay and sorrow. Where summer blazed, she brought endless twilight. The split created a fundamental divide that would structure Fae politics forever after. Seelie and unseelie became more than mere descriptive terms but political alignments with profound implications. Fae creatures across the Feywild found themselves forced to choose sides or declare neutrality in a conflict they had no part in creating. The courts themselves became opposing poles around which all other power had to orient itself. War did not erupt immediately, but its inevitability hung over every interaction between the courts like a sword suspended by a thread. The Prince of Frost had been among the most celebrated knights of Titania's summer court before his transformation. He embodied summer in its most passionate aspect, a warrior of legendary prowess whose presence on any battlefield guaranteed victory. He fell in love with a mortal woman who had wandered into the Feywild through a forgotten gate, and that love proved to be his destruction. He courted her with gifts of impossible beauty, and convinced her to remain in the Feywild as his eternal companion. She agreed, and they lived in joy for what he experienced as decades. Time betrayed them. The mortal woman aged according to material plane chronology, even while dwelling in the Feywild, decades passing for her in what the prince perceived as mere years. He watched her grow old and frail while he remained eternally young and vital. She died in his arms, and the grief transformed him more completely than any magic could have achieved. His summer nature inverted into its opposite. His warm, golden radiance became cold silver light. His passionate intensity froze into glacial fury. The Prince of Frost abandoned the summer court and traveled to the furthest northern reaches of the Feywild. His grief manifested physically, flash freezing everything within miles of his passage. He arrived at a location where ancient glaciers had stood since the plane's formation and claimed them as his domain. He constructed the palace of frozen tears from ice that would never melt, each room decorated with sculptures depicting moments from his lost love's life. He became Archfey through the intensity of his sorrow, achieving power that rivaled Titania's own but twisted toward completely different ends. The Prince of Frost's transformation demonstrated that Archfey status could be achieved through means other than birth from the plane itself. Beings could ascend to that rank through accumulated power, legendary deeds, or transformative experiences so profound they fundamentally rewrote the bearer's nature. This revelation changed how ambitious Fae approached advancement. If the prince could achieve such status through grief, what might others accomplish through different emotions or experiences? Hearsam the Satyr had wandered the Feywild as a musician and trickster for thousands of years before his ascension. He possessed no noble lineage or territorial claims, surviving through wit and charm while playing his panpipes, for anyone who would listen. He specialized in satires that mocked the powerful and songs that revealed uncomfortable truths about Fae politics. Most Archfey tolerated him as harmless entertainment. That tolerance proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Hearsam attended a revel thrown by Titania to celebrate the Summer Court's 500th anniversary. The celebration lasted 40 years in Feywild time, an endless party where reality itself bent to accommodate the revelers' increasingly creative desires. Hearsam played throughout the entire celebration, his music weaving through crowds and carrying enchantments so subtle that even Titania's most skilled mages failed to detect them. He was stealing power directly from the celebration itself, siphoning tiny amounts from thousands of attendees and accumulating it within his own being. The theft remained undetected until the revel finally concluded and attendees began experiencing unexpected exhaustion and diminished magical capacity. Investigation revealed what Hearsam had done, but by then he had already fled with stolen power sufficient to elevate him to Archfey status. He declared himself the Prince of Fools and established no permanent court, instead traveling the Feywild and holding mobile revels wherever he chose. He had become an Archfey of chaos and celebration, impossible to pin down or predict. Titania raged at the betrayal but could not undo what had been accomplished through trickery rather than force. The Green Lords had existed since the Feywild's earliest ages, ancient treants and plant creatures who predated even Titania's emergence. They claimed authority over all growing things through simple fact of having been present first. They had tolerated the rise of the Fey courts because neither summer nor gloaming could challenge their dominion over the deepest forests. But as courts expanded and claimed more territory, the Green Lords recognized that their ancient authority faced genuine threats. The eldest of the Green Lords, an oak treant named Grandfather Tree who had witnessed the plains formation, called a conclave in the heart of the primeval forest. Every treant, dryad, and plant creature of significant power attended. They debated for 7 years, their discussions conducted at the patient pace of growing things rather than the frenetic speed favored by humanoid Fey. They emerged from that conclave unified in purpose and declaration. The Green Lords announced they would tolerate no further expansion of Fey courts into the deep forests. They established borders marking territories they claimed as sovereign green domains where no court law applied and no archfey authority was recognized. They declared they would destroy any settlement or military force that crossed those borders without explicit permission. They were not declaring war but establishing facts that could not be negotiated or compromised. The forests were theirs and would remain theirs regardless of what political structures rose and fell around them. Both Titania and the Queen of Air and Darkness tested these declarations by sending expeditions into green territories without seeking permission. The expeditions vanished without trace. Follow-up investigations discovered nothing except forests that showed no signs of recent passage. The Green Lords had made their point through demonstration rather than threat. The courts recognized the borders afterward and directed expansion into other territories where resistance would be less absolute. Baba Yaga arrived in the Feywild during this era of Archfey ascension, though no one witnessed her entry or understood her origins. She simply appeared one day in a clearing where her dancing hut perched on its massive chicken legs. She was a being of immense power who fit no established category, neither fully Fey nor completely mortal, but something else that defied classification. She commanded magic that operated according to principles unknown to even the most learned Eladrin archmages. The hag established her presence through a simple declaration. She would offer bargains to anyone who sought her out, providing magical services in exchange for payment she determined appropriate to each request. She claimed no territory beyond the immediate area around her hut. She declared allegiance to no court. She simply existed as an independent power who would deal with anyone regardless of political affiliation. The courts attempted to recruit or intimidate her into choosing sides, but discovered she could not be moved by any inducement or threat. Baba Yaga began collecting things through her bargains. She took names from those who sought her services, binding individuals to her through their most fundamental identity. She claimed firstborn children as payment for granting fertility or curing disease. She accumulated magical artifacts and forbidden knowledge, storing them within her hut's impossibly vast interior. She created bloodlines, bound to her service across dozens of material plane kingdoms, ensuring she would never lack for worshippers or servants. She was building power through accumulation rather than conquest, achieving influence through countless small bindings rather than dramatic displays. The Sea Lords emerged in the oceanic regions as aquatic counterparts to terrestrial archfey. Elias, a being who appeared as an impossibly beautiful Eladrin with scales instead of skin, established dominion over the Mercandraw and all waters touched by moonlight. He commanded sea dragons and water elementals, creating an underwater empire that rivaled surface kingdoms in complexity and sophistication. He maintained minimal contact with terrestrial powers, preferring to develop his own independent sphere of influence beneath the waves. Verenestra, the Oak Princess, claimed sovereignty over dryads and woodland spirits in territories that bordered green domains without actually violating them. She positioned herself as an intermediary between the Green Lords and the Fey courts, someone who understood both perspectives and could negotiate solutions to territorial disputes. She established the Sylvan Grove as explicitly neutral territory where representatives of any court or faction could meet without fear of attack or capture. The Grove became essential to Fey diplomacy, one of the few locations where Seelie and Unseelie could interact without immediate violence. The Earl King established the wild hunt tradition by gathering the greatest Fey warriors into an eternal pursuit across the plain. He crafted supernatural hounds from solidified moonlight and trained them to track any quarry across any distance. He declared that the wild hunt would pursue those who violated fundamental Fey laws. Individuals who broke hospitality or committed betrayals so profound they could not be forgiven. The hunt became enforcement mechanism and terror weapon simultaneously, ensuring compliance with customs that lacked any formal legal structure. Thrumbolg rose from goblin origins to claim the kingdom of Noctur through a combination of brutal conquest and dark pacts with entities from the Shadowfell. He became the first and only goblinoid to achieve Archfey status, demonstrating that such power was not limited to traditionally beautiful or noble Fey. His kingdom existed in perpetual twilight, filled with goblin tribes who served him through fear rather than love. He maintained minimal interaction with other Archfey, content to rule his own territories without attempting expansion or alliance. The Archfey collectively recognized that unlimited conflict between their various courts and factions would eventually damage the Feywild itself. They gathered at Verenestra's Sylvan Grove to negotiate the Oath of Summer and Winter, a binding compact that would govern interactions between major powers. The negotiations lasted for decades, with each Archfey protecting their own interests while trying to prevent catastrophic war. The oath that emerged from these negotiations was a masterwork of careful compromise and deliberate loopholes. It prevented direct military conflict between Archfey and forbade assassination of sovereigns. It established protocols for territorial disputes and mechanisms for resolving grievances through proxies rather than personal combat. But it explicitly permitted espionage, political maneuvering, proxy conflicts, and nearly every other form of interference short of open war. The Archfey had agreed to limit themselves just enough to prevent mutual destruction, while preserving maximum freedom for the games of power they all enjoyed. The Age of Chaos was ending, replaced by something far more dangerous: structure. The Oath of Summer and Winter lasted exactly 17 years before the first violation. Neither Titania nor the Queen of Air and Darkness ordered the attack directly, but both understood that plausible deniability meant nothing when 7 Summer Court nobles died during a diplomatic feast at the border between territories. The assassins wore no identifying marks and left no survivors who could testify to their allegiance, but everyone knew the Gloaming Court had struck first and the Age of Shadow conflict had begun. The War of Painted Masks earned its name from the custom both courts adopted of sending agents to conduct violence while wearing elaborate disguises. Assassins struck at diplomatic gatherings, poisoned water supplies serving enemy settlements, and kidnapped high-value targets for ransom or execution. But they always wore masks crafted to implicate third parties or obscure their true allegiances. A Summer Court spy might wear a mask depicting winter motifs while murdering a gloaming diplomat, creating confusion about which faction actually bore responsibility. The deception became so sophisticated that even the courts themselves sometimes struggled to determine which attacks were genuine and which were false flag operations. The casualties mounted steadily over decades. Noble families saw their lineages extinguished through targeted killings. Trade routes became too dangerous to travel without heavy military escort. Settlements near the border between Summer and Gloaming territories were abandoned as residents fled to safer regions. The war never escalated into open military conflict, which would have violated the oath, but the cumulative death toll exceeded what many conventional wars would have produced. The violence existed in a perpetual state of deniability, acknowledged by everyone but admissible by none. Lesser Fey suffered disproportionately compared to Archfey and their immediate circles. Pixies found themselves conscripted as spies due to their small size and natural invisibility. Dryads saw their trees burned when they refused to provide intelligence about enemy movements. Satyrs who traditionally moved freely between courts discovered they could no longer maintain neutrality, forced to choose sides or face persecution from both. The war transformed the Feywild's social dynamics, replacing the anarchic freedom of earlier ages with paranoid vigilance and factional loyalty enforced through terror. Titania responded to the initial assassinations by unleashing the wild hunt against unseelie holdings in the darkened hills. She invoked ancient rights as Queen of Summer, claiming that the murdered nobles had been under her protection and their deaths demanded blood vengeance. The Earl King accepted her petition because the law supported it, though he warned that he would pursue Summer Court targets just as enthusiastically if they violated hospitality in turn. The hunt assembled at dawn on the summer solstice and rode forth with supernatural hounds baying for unseelie blood. The wild hunt devastated the darkened hills over 3 years of relentless pursuit. The Earl King's warriors tracked every gloaming noble who had been present at the feast where the Summer Court nobles died, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. They pursued their quarry across thousands of miles, cornering victims in locations they believed secure and executing them according to ancient ritual. The hunt killed 47 unseelie Fey before Titania finally called them off, satisfied that honor had been adequately restored. The darkened hills never recovered. The wild hunt's passage had done more than kill individuals. The supernatural energies released by so many ritual executions poisoned the land itself, creating zones where reality fractured and madness seeped through the cracks. Entire forests withered and died despite the Feywild's natural abundance. Rivers ran backward and upward, defying gravity in ways that suggested fundamental damage to local space. Thousands of lesser Fey fled the region, becoming refugees who strained resources in neighboring territories. The Queen of Air and Darkness could not respond with equivalent force without violating the oath's prohibitions against open warfare. She chose a different path. Gloaming agents infiltrated Summer Court territories and began a campaign of systematic sabotage that targeted infrastructure rather than individuals. They poisoned wells serving Eladrin settlements. They burned granaries and destroyed food stores. They collapsed bridges and blocked trade routes. The attacks caused no direct deaths but created cascading failures that led to starvation, disease, and economic collapse in targeted regions. Neutral Archfey recognized that the conflict was spiraling toward catastrophe. Verenestra, the Oak Princess, sent urgent messages to both courts, warning that continued escalation would eventually force other powers to choose sides and transform a bilateral conflict into a plain-wide war. She offered the Sylvan Grove as neutral ground for negotiations and guaranteed safe passage for diplomatic representatives. Both Titania and the Queen of Air and Darkness initially refused, each demanding the other apologize first for initiating hostilities. But the economic damage and refugee crisis eventually forced both to reconsider. The Treaty of Flowing Waters was negotiated over 3 years at the River of Sighs, a tributary of the Mercandraw that marked natural boundaries between summer and gloaming territories. Verenestra presided over discussions that involved dozens of representatives from both courts, along with observers from neutral factions. The negotiations nearly collapsed multiple times when representatives walked out over perceived insults or unacceptable demands. Verenestra prevented total breakdown through patient mediation and willingness to propose creative compromises that addressed underlying interests rather than stated positions. The treaty that emerged established formal borders between summer and gloaming territories for the first time. The borders shifted with the seasons, expanding summer territories during hot months while granting more land to the gloaming court during winter. This seasonal oscillation meant neither side gained permanent advantage while acknowledging that both courts possessed legitimate claims to disputed regions. The treaty also created buffer zones administered by neutral powers, preventing direct contact between summer and gloaming settlements. Additional provisions addressed the specific grievances that had sparked the conflict. Both courts agreed to cease assassination campaigns against each other's nobles and established formal protocols for resolving disputes through arbitration rather than violence. They created prisoner exchange mechanisms and agreed to respect diplomatic immunity for official envoys. They even established limited trade agreements, recognizing that economic interdependence would make future conflicts more costly for both sides. The treaty, held for exactly 90 years before the Prince of Frost, shattered the fragile peace. He had spent those decades consolidating power in the frozen north, transforming his grief into something far more dangerous. He developed a ritual of catastrophic scope, one that would transform the entire Feywild into an eternal winter realm where summer could never return and grief would be the only emotion strong enough to survive. He believed that if all existence shared his sorrow, his own pain would finally become bearable. The Prince of Frost began his ritual during the winter solstice, when his power reached its annual peak. He sacrificed 1,000 bound Fey at locations arranged in a perfect geometric pattern across his territories. Their deaths released massive amounts of magical energy that he channeled into a spell working that had taken decades to design. Ice began spreading from his palace at a rate of miles per hour, flash freezing everything it touched and converting living matter into crystalline sculptures that would never decay. The expanding ice threatened to consume the entire northern Feywild within months if left unchecked. It crossed into territories belonging to both the Summer and Gloaming courts, destroying settlements regardless of political affiliation. It violated green domains, killing ancient trees the Green Lords had protected since the Plains formation. It represented an existential threat to every faction in the Feywild, one that transcended court politics and ancient grudges. Everything changed in that moment. Titania sent urgent messages to the Queen of Air and Darkness, proposing an alliance against the Prince of Frost. The Dark Queen responded within hours, something unprecedented in the hostile relationship between courts. Representatives from both sides met at the Sylvan Grove and hammered out a military cooperation agreement in 3 days, work that would normally have required years of negotiation. They recognized that survival demanded setting aside their conflict and focusing all available force against the threat spreading from the north. The coalition assembled the Replias, largest military force the Feywild had seen since the Dawn War. Summer Court knights rode alongside Unseelie assassins. Eladrin battle mages coordinated with Gloaming shadow weavers. The Wild Hunt joined without requiring petition or payment, recognizing that the Prince of Frost's actions violated laws more fundamental than any court rivalry. Even some Green Lords contributed forces, sending ancient treants who could withstand cold that would kill lesser beings. The Battle of Frozen Tears lasted 7 days and nights without pause. The coalition forces fought through the expanding ice toward the Prince of Frost's palace, sustaining horrific casualties as they advanced. The prince defended with magic that turned attacking soldiers into ice sculptures or drove them mad with visions of their own worst griefs. He summoned blizzards that reduced visibility to nothing and created ice elementals that fought with inhuman ferocity. He was a single archfey fighting an army and nearly won through sheer power and determination. The breakthrough came when a strike team of Summer Court knights and Gloaming assassins penetrated the palace's inner sanctum while the prince focused on the main battle. They discovered the ritual's central anchor, a crystallized tear the prince had shed on the day his mortal lover died. The artifact pulsed with power sufficient to fuel the winter transformation for centuries. The strike team destroyed it through coordinated magical assault, shattering the crystallized tear and breaking the ritual at its foundation. The Prince of Frost felt the ritual's collapse and screamed in rage and renewed grief. The expanding ice halted immediately and began slowly receding, though it would take decades to fully retreat from the territories it had claimed. The prince himself retreated deep into his palace and refused all contact with the outside world. He survived the battle, but his power had been permanently diminished by the ritual's failure and the loss of his most precious artifact. The coalition victory had profound implications for Feywild politics. Seelie and Unseelie forces had fought together successfully, demonstrating that cooperation was possible when existential threats demanded it. The experience created personal bonds between warriors who had previously been blood enemies. Veterans from both courts returned home, telling stories of the courage and skill they had witnessed in supposed rivals. The rigid factional divisions that had structured Fey society for centuries began showing cracks, but the cooperation proved temporary. Within a year of victory, the Summer and Gloaming courts resumed their shadow conflict. The assassination campaigns restarted. Trade embargoes were reinstated. The Treaty of Flowing Waters remained nominally in force, but both sides violated its spirit constantly while maintaining technical compliance with its letter. The brief alliance against the Prince of Frost became historical curiosity rather than foundation for lasting peace. The conflict between courts nevertheless evolved after the Northern Crisis. Neither side wanted to risk creating another threat that might unite their enemies against them. Assassinations became more targeted, focusing on genuinely dangerous opponents rather than random terror attacks. Sabotage campaigns were limited to avoid causing humanitarian disasters that might trigger neutral intervention. The war continued, but in more controlled and calculated forms. The formal crystallization of Seelie and Unseelie designations as political allegiances rather than mere descriptions occurred during this era. Fey creatures across the Feywild found themselves pressured to declare which side they supported in the eternal conflict between Summer and Gloaming. Those who proclaimed loyalty to Titania became Seelie, while those who aligned with the Queen of Air and Darkness were designated Unseelie. The terms carried profound implications for social status, economic opportunity, and physical safety. Thousands of lesser courts declared themselves for one side or the other during this period. A Sylph court in the Eastern Mountains proclaimed Seelie allegiance and immediately gained Summer court protection against hostile neighbors. A Goblin kingdom in the Western Swamps declared for the Unseelie and received Gloaming court support in territorial disputes. The great courts used these subordinate alliances to extend their influence without directly violating treaties that limited their own territorial expansion. The Feywild became a patchwork of aligned and neutral territories, with the balance of power shifting constantly as minor courts switched allegiances or were conquered and absorbed. The Green Lords maintained their absolute neutrality throughout the court wars, but enforced that neutrality with escalating violence. They established clear protocols that any military force entering Green territories without explicit permission would be destroyed immediately without warning or negotiation. Both Summer and Gloaming courts tested these protocols through small scouting parties and border violations. Every test ended the same way. The forces vanished completely, leaving no survivors and no bodies. One particularly notable incident occurred when a Summer court army of 3,000 knights entered the primeval forest while pursuing Unseelie raiders. The Green Lords responded by causing the forest itself to attack. Trees animated and crushed soldiers in their branches. Roots erupted from the ground and dragged knights into the earth. Swarms of insects and clouds of poisonous spores killed hundreds in minutes. The army routed within an hour, with fewer than 200 survivors making it back to Summer court territory. Titania sent formal apology to the Green Lords and never again allowed her forces to violate Green borders. The War of Flowers erupted when Hirsum, the Prince of Fools, declared himself ruler of all Fey music and merriment, directly challenging Titania's authority over celebratory aspects of Summer. He backed his claim by stealing additional power during revels he hosted, gradually accumulating strength that rivaled the Summer Queen's own. He composed satirical songs mocking Titania's leadership and performed them at courts across the Feywild, building popular support among Fey who appreciated his irreverent humor. Titania could not ignore such open challenge to her sovereignty. She declared Hirsum an enemy of the Summer court and forbade any Seelie Fey from attending his performances or providing him sanctuary. Hirsum responded by hosting a massive revel that lasted 7 years and attracted tens of thousands of Fey from all factions. The revel became his mobile power base, moving constantly to avoid Summer court forces while demonstrating that many Fey preferred his chaotic leadership to Titania's structured rulership. The war was fought through art rather than violence. Titania commissioned the greatest Fey bards to compose works celebrating Summer's glory and condemning Hirsum's presumption. Here some countered with songs of such beauty and wit that even loyal summer court nobles found themselves humming the tunes. Eladrin poets competed with satyr musicians. Dryad dancers performed pieces supporting one side or the other. The conflict became a cultural referendum on what Fey nature truly meant and whether structure or chaos better served the Feywild's essential character. The Gloaming Court discovered during this era that they could corrupt natural Fey into Darklings through exposure to concentrated shadow magic drawn from the Shadowfell. The process was irreversible and destroyed most of what made the original creature an individual, replacing personality with fanatical loyalty to unseelie authority. But the resulting Darklings possessed abilities natural Fey lacked, including immunity to many forms of magic and enhanced physical capabilities that made them formidable warriors. The Queen of Air and Darkness began producing Darklings by the thousands. She established conversion facilities in the deepest parts of her territory where captured Fey underwent the transformation process. Many died during conversion, but enough survived to create an army of twisted servants who would never question orders or betray their masters. The Darklings shifted the military balance significantly in the Gloaming Court's favor, providing shock troops that could be deployed without concern for casualties or morale. Titania responded to the Darkling threat not through military escalation but through creative application of stolen power. She transformed the power Hirsum had taken from her during his original theft and used it to create the Endless Revel, a permanent celebration that existed in a pocket dimension accessible only through gates she controlled. She trapped Hirsum inside the Endless Revel during one of his own performances, condemning him to experience eternal celebration without ability to leave or pause. The punishment was perfectly calibrated to Hirsum's nature. He had sought to become the lord of revelry and celebration. Titania gave him exactly that, in quantities and duration no being could tolerate. For 50 years, Hirsum experienced non-stop festivities that never diminished in intensity or allowed for rest. The constant stimulation drove him to the edge of madness. When Titania finally released him, he was a changed being, still the Prince of Fools, but far more cautious about directly challenging her authority. The courts achieved an equilibrium, as each major power recognized the futility of seeking total victory. Titania commanded the greatest territory and largest army, but could not eliminate the Gloaming Court without violating oaths that would turn neutral powers against her. The Queen of Air and Darkness wielded dangerous magic and fearsome Darkling forces, but lacked resources for sustained offensive campaigns. The Prince of Testri, Frost, remained dangerous but diminished. Hirsum had been humbled. The Archfey settled into a pattern of managed conflict that would define Feywild politics for centuries. The age of total war was ending, replaced by something far more complex: politics. The Eladrin had built a civilization in the Feywild that spanned continents and encompassed millions of inhabitants. Their cities gleamed with crystalline spires and living architecture. Their universities taught magic that material plane wizards could only dream of mastering. Their noble houses traced lineages back to the first tribes who passed through Corellon's gates. But beneath the surface grandeur, philosophical fractures had been widening for centuries. The question of what it meant to be Eladrin, and whether that identity required connection to their mortal origins, was about to tear their civilization apart. The theological disputes began in the academies of Senalies, where scholars debated the nature of Corellon Larithian and what the god truly intended when opening the gates to the Feywild. Conservative theologians argued that Corellon had offered transformation as enhancement of elven nature rather than replacement of it. They pointed to ancient texts describing the god as patron of all elves, both those who remained in the material plane and those who accepted transformation. They insisted that Eladrin, who abandoned all connection to mortality, betrayed Corellon's fundamental vision. Radical theologians countered with interpretations that depicted the Great Crossing as deliberate severance from mortal limitations. They claimed Corellon had offered escape from mortality itself, creating a new race that transcended elven origins entirely. They argued that maintaining connection to the material plane held Eladrin back from achieving their full potential as beings of pure magic. They demanded complete commitment to the Feywild and rejection of anything that tied them to mortal existence. The debates consumed Eladrin intellectual life for generations. Prominent scholars published treatises running thousands of pages, defending their interpretations. Universities split into competing schools that refused to acknowledge each other's credentials. Noble houses aligned with one position or the other, turning theological disagreement into political factionalism. Young Eladrin found themselves forced to declare positions on questions their ancestors had never needed to answer. The arguments grew increasingly bitter as both sides recognized that fundamental identity hung in the balance. The city of Senalies became the epicenter of both theological debate and magical experimentation. A radical faction of Eladrin, led by the archmage Valandras, believed they had discovered a ritual that would sever all connection to the material plane, transforming Eladrin into purely Fey beings with no remaining mortal heritage. They believed such transformation represented the natural culmination of what Corellon had begun, completing a process that had been left deliberately unfinished so Eladrin could choose their own destiny. Valandras assembled 300 mages who supported his vision. They spent 7 years designing and refining the ritual, consulting texts that dated back to the Feywild's formation and incorporating magical principles that pushed the boundaries of what even Eladrin archmages believed possible. The ritual required power on a scale that individual casting could never achieve, demanding coordinated effort from hundreds of casters working in perfect synchronization. They scheduled the casting for the spring equinox, when the barriers between planes grew thinnest and planar magic flowed most freely. The ritual began at dawn on the appointed day. 300 Eladrin mages positioned themselves throughout Senalies, each standing at specific locations where the city's ley lines intersected. Valandras directed the working from the central plaza, his voice magically amplified so every participant could hear his instructions. They began channeling power simultaneously, drawing on Senalies's accumulated magical reserves and their own considerable abilities. The city's living crystal walls began glowing with intense light as more energy flowed through them than the architects had ever intended. Something went catastrophically wrong. The ritual did not sever Senalies's connection to the material plane cleanly, but instead trapped the entire city in a state of planar flux. The city began phasing randomly between the Feywild, material plane, and Shadowfell, spending years in each location before suddenly shifting to another. The transitions occurred without warning or pattern. Residents went to sleep in the Feywild's eternal twilight and woke in the material plane's mundane darkness. They spent decades establishing relationships with material plane neighbors, only to phase into the Shadowfell and find themselves surrounded by undead horrors. Thousands of Eladrin died in the initial disaster. The sudden transition to the Shadowfell proved particularly deadly, as that plane's life-draining nature killed those with weak constitutions within hours. The shifts between planes disrupted magical infrastructure that Senalies's population depended on for food production and water purification. Panic spread as residents realized they were trapped in a city that could appear anywhere without warning, vulnerable to threats from 3 different planes. Those who survived the first year went mad from the unpredictability. Parents watched their children age at different rates depending on which plane the city currently inhabited. Relationships fractured when lovers found themselves separated by planar boundaries they could not cross. The city's economy collapsed as merchants could no longer maintain reliable trade relationships. Senalies transformed from the greatest Eladrin metropolis into a ghost city haunted by traumatized Ati survivors who could never escape. Valandras survived the catastrophe, but lost his mind to guilt and horror. He spent the rest of his life trying to reverse the ritual, or at least stabilize Senalies in a single plane. Every attempt failed. He died 300 years after the disaster, still trapped in the city he had destroyed. His final words, recorded by witnesses, were a warning that some transformations could never be undone, and some questions should never be answered through magic. The Senalies disaster polarized Eladrin civilization completely. Conservative factions pointed to it as definitive proof that severing connection to the material plane violated natural law and invited catastrophe. They demanded immediate cessation of all similar experiments and renewed emphasis on maintaining ties to mortal origins. They found a leader in the scholar Prince Rothilion of Astrozalion, a respected intellectual who had warned against Valandris's ritual before its casting. Rothilion argued that the disaster demonstrated fundamental truths about Eladrin nature. They were transformed elves rather than wholly new beings, and that dual nature defined their essential identity. Attempting to eliminate the mortal component meant destroying what made them Eladrin rather than simple Fey. He proposed a radical solution to prevent future disasters. The Eladrin should return to the material plane entirely, abandoning the Feywild and reverting to mortal existence over generations. Only by embracing their elven heritage could they avoid the fate that had befallen Senalies. The proposal horrified radical factions who had spent centuries celebrating their transformation and superior magical abilities. They viewed Rothilion's plan as betrayal of everything Eladrin had achieved. A passionate young mage named Illyria emerged as the leading voice for the radical position. She argued that the Senalies disaster resulted from flawed ritual design rather than any fundamental problem, with the goal of severing material plane connections. She insisted that Eladrin who returned to mortality would be abandoning Corellan's gift and condemning their descendants to inferior existence. Nothing could bridge the divide. The exodus began within a decade of the Senalies disaster. Rothilion led tens of thousands of conservative Eladrin back through the ancient gates. Corellon had opened millennia earlier. They established settlements in the material plane's forests, deliberately choosing locations far from existing elven communities. They wanted to preserve their distinct identity while gradually reverting to mortal biology over generations. They called themselves the Returning Ones and declared they were reclaiming their true heritage. The transformation back to mortality proved slower than the original transformation to Eladrin had been. The Returning Ones retained their magical abilities and extended lifespans for several generations. Their children showed increasingly mortal characteristics with each successive birth. After 5 centuries, their descendants were indistinguishable from material plane elves, except for faint traces of Fey ancestry that manifested as unusual eye colors or minor magical talents. The Eladrin who returned had become elves again, completing a cycle that had taken thousands of years. Those who remained in the Feywild grew more alien with each passing century. Without the moderating influence of conservative factions, radical philosophies dominated Eladrin culture. They embraced increasingly extreme Fey transformations, deliberately seeking out experiences that would push them further from mortal origins. Their seasonal aspects became more pronounced, with winter Eladrin barely able to experience warmth and summer Eladrin finding cold physically painful. Their emotions grew more volatile, shifting from euphoria to despair within moments. They were becoming something genuinely Fey, rather than merely Fey-touched. The remaining Eladrin developed abilities and characteristics that their conservative ancestors would have considered corruptions. Some gained the power to physically manifest their emotions as weather, generating localized storms or sunshine based on mood. Others found they could enter the dreams of sleeping creatures and manipulate those dreams according to their desires. A few discovered they could step sideways out of normal space, becoming partially incorporeal for brief periods. These abilities marked them as fundamentally different from the elves who had returned to the material plane. The city of Mithrandain fell to the Gloaming Court during this period of chaos and division. The Queen of Air and Darkness had long coveted the city's historical archives, recognizing that knowledge accumulated over millennia of Eladrin scholarship might contain information about Archfey vulnerabilities or forgotten magics. She waited until the Exodus had depleted Mithrandain's population by half and its military forces by even more. Then, she struck with overwhelming force. The attack came at midnight during the new moon, when shadows held maximum power. 10,000 Darkling warriors emerged from shadow gates opened directly inside Mithrandain's walls, bypassing external defenses entirely. They killed any Eladrin who resisted and drove the rest into the streets as refugees. The Queen of Air and Darkness herself entered the city once resistance collapsed and went directly to the singing trees that contained the historical archives. She spent 3 days extracting information from the trees, using shadow magic to force them to reveal secrets they had been designed to protect. She learned the true names of several Archfey rivals. She discovered weaknesses in Titania's defenses that the Summer Queen believed no one knew. She found records of ancient pacts and alliances that could be exploited for political advantage. The knowledge she gained from Mithrendain's archives made her significantly more dangerous to every other power in the Feywild. The Gloaming Court held Mithrendain for 2 centuries before neutral powers negotiated its return to Eladrin control. By then, the city was a shadow of its former glory. The singing trees had been traumatized by forced interrogation, and many had gone silent permanently. The population never recovered its pre-conquest levels. The archives were incomplete, with crucial sections destroyed or stolen. Mithrendain survived, but as a memorial to what had been lost, rather than a living center of scholarship. Astrazalion completed its evolution into a fully independent city-state during this era of fragmentation. The city's unique nature as a settlement that phased between planes meant it attracted Eladrin from all philosophical factions. Conservatives appreciated its material plane connections while radicals valued its Feywild presence. The city's leadership recognized that trying to force ideological conformity would tear Astrazalion apart as it had destroyed broader Eladrin unity. The city's ruling council declared absolute neutrality in the theological debates consuming the rest of Eladrin's civilization. They forbade public advocacy for either returning to the material plane or severing all mortal connections. They established Astrazalion as a place where Eladrin of any philosophy could live without persecution or pressure to conform. The policy proved remarkably successful, allowing the city to maintain stability while the rest of Eladrin's civilization fractured. Astrazalion's neutrality came at a cost. The city could never mobilize for large-scale military action because any aggressive move would violate someone's ideological principles. It could not form permanent alliances with other Eladrin nations because those nations demanded ideological alignment as precondition for cooperation. It became wealthy and stable but politically isolated, a city that mattered economically but carried little weight in broader Eladrin politics. The remaining Eladrin nations recognized they would never reunify under a single government or philosophy. Representatives from 7 surviving city-states met at the Sylvan Grove under Verenestra's mediation to establish a framework for coexistence without unity. The resulting Pact of Sevenfold Seasons acknowledged that Eladrin civilization would continue as independent domains rather than a single empire. The pact established protocols for mutual defense against external threats while explicitly rejecting any form of centralized authority. Each signatory nation retained complete sovereignty over internal affairs and could pursue whatever relationship with the material plane its population preferred. The nations agreed to maintain diplomatic embassies in each other's territories and to honor trade agreements. They promised to provide military assistance if any signatory faced existential threats from non-Eladrin powers. The pact deliberately avoided addressing the theological questions that had sparked the schism. It treated those issues as matters of individual national policy rather than questions requiring collective answers. This pragmatic approach allowed cooperation on practical matters while acknowledging that fundamental disagreements about identity and nature could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. The final break occurred when the last High King of the Eladrin, an ancient noble named Luthiel who claimed descent from the first tribes to pass through Corellan's gates, dissolved his own throne. He called an assembly at Astrazalion and announced that the era of unified Eladrin civilization had ended permanently. He declared that future generations would remember them not as a single people, but as scattered nations that happened to share common ancestry. He removed his crown and shattered it on the floor of the assembly hall, creating fragments that he distributed to the leaders of the 7 signatory nations. Luthiel's abdication marked the formal end of Eladrin unity. The nations that had signed the Pact of Sevenfold Seasons continued as independent powers, pursuing their own distinct visions of what Eladrin nature meant and what their relationship to other planes should be. They maintained diplomatic relationships and honored mutual defense commitments, but they were no longer one people attempting to speak with one voice. They had become separate civilizations, linked by history rather than unified by purpose. The Age of Empire was ending, replaced by something more complex and fragmented. The barriers between the Feywild and material plane had always been thin in certain locations, places where reality wore away like fabric rubbed too often in the same spot. Mortals discovered these thin places through accident and deliberate exploration, stumbling into a realm that operated according to rules their civilizations had never prepared them to understand. Some returned with tales of wonder and terror. Most never returned at all. But the traffic between worlds increased steadily as mortal magic grew more sophisticated and the Feywild's reputation spread through legend and song. Human wizards from the material plane achieved the breakthrough during Netheral's golden age, when arcane research reached heights that would not be matched again for millennia. The archwizards of the flying cities developed gate magic reliable enough for repeated use, spells that could tear openings between planes and hold them stable for hours or days at a time. They began systematic exploration of the Feywild, sending expeditions to catalog its resources and assess whether portions could be claimed as Netherese territory. The explorers returned with specimens of magical plants that grew nowhere else, samples of crystallized arcane energy, and reports of civilizations that predated human history. The Archfey watched the Netherese incursions with curiosity that quickly soured into concern. The early human visitors displayed appropriate caution and respect, treating the Feywild as dangerous territory requiring careful navigation. But as Netherese confidence grew, their explorers became increasingly arrogant. They harvested magical resources without seeking permission. They captured Fey creatures for study and experimentation. They mapped territories as if preparing for colonization. The Archfey recognized patterns they had seen before when dragons first invaded the Feywild millennia earlier. Titania initially welcomed mortal visitors to her territories, seeing opportunities for entertainment and cultural exchange. She hosted several Netherese expeditions at the summer court, providing demonstrations of Fey magic and allowing the humans to witness revel celebrations. She believed that building positive relationships with material plane powers would benefit both realms. But she quickly discovered that mortal ambition operated on timescales and according to motivations completely foreign to Fey nature. The humans were not interested in friendship or cultural exchange. They wanted resources and power. A Netherese archwizard named Eolam attempted to claim a section of the Feywild's northern forests as personal territory. He established a fortified outpost, staffed by bound elementals and golems, declared sovereignty over 1,000 square miles of wilderness, and began systematic harvesting of rare magical plants. He ignored protests from local Fey and Eladrin communities, dismissing them as primitives without legitimate authority. His attitude reflected broader Netherese beliefs that their magical superiority granted them rights over less advanced civilizations. Titania responded by personally visiting Eolam's outpost. She arrived alone during a summer thunderstorm and demanded audience with the Archwizard. Eolam agreed to meet, confident that his defenses and personal power would protect him from any threat a single Fey could pose. Titania asked him once to abandon his claim and depart peacefully. When he refused, she destroyed his entire outpost in less than an hour. She shattered his defensive wards with casual gestures. She banished his elementals back to their home planes. She reduced his fortifications to rubble and scattered his supplies across 100 miles of forest. Eolam barely escaped with his life. He fled back to Netheril and reported that the Feywild's native powers were far more dangerous than initial assessments suggested. His experience tempered Netherese ambitions significantly. Future expeditions took greater care to seek permission before harvesting resources and avoided claiming territory outright. The Archfey had established that the Feywild was not empty wilderness waiting for colonization, but a realm with its own powers who would defend it violently if necessary. The warlock tradition emerged from mortal desperation rather than systematic magical research. A human woman named Eliara lived in a kingdom suffering prolonged drought and famine. Traditional prayers to gods went unanswered. Wizards lacked knowledge to alter weather patterns affecting such large territories. Eliara heard legends of the Feywild and the powerful beings who ruled it. She traveled alone into the wilderness, found a thin place between worlds, and crossed over with no training or preparation. Eliara wandered the Feywild for weeks before encountering one of Titania's knights. She fell to her knees and begged for help, offering anything in exchange for power to save her people. The knight found her sincerity compelling and brought her to the summer court. Titania listened to Eliara's petition and recognized an opportunity. She could not intervene directly in material plane affairs without violating divine protocols, but she could grant power to a mortal who would act on her behalf. Titania offered a pact. She would grant Eliara magical abilities drawn directly from the Feywild, powers sufficient to break droughts and restore fertility to blighted lands. In exchange, Eliara would serve as Titania's agent in the material plane, advancing the Summer Court's interests and recruiting others to similar service. Eliara accepted without hesitation. Titania placed her hand on Eliara's forehead and established a permanent magical connection, transforming a desperate mortal into the first warlock. Eliara returned to her kingdom and used her new powers to end the drought within days. She called storms that watered parched fields and restored dried rivers. She blessed crops with accelerated growth that produced harvests in weeks rather than months. She saved thousands from starvation and became celebrated as a miracle worker. But the power came with costs that grew apparent slowly. Eliara aged faster than normal humans. Her personality shifted to reflect Titania's preferences and values. She could feel the Summer Queen's attention on her constantly, a weight that never lifted. Other mortals sought similar pacts after witnessing what Eliara achieved. The Archfey recognized warlocks as perfect tools for extending their influence without requiring personal presence in the material plane. Titania, the Queen of Air and Darkness, Hursum, and dozens of lesser Archfey began offering pacts to desperate or ambitious mortals. Each patron customized their offerings according to their own nature and goals. Summer warlocks gained power over life and growth. Gloaming warlocks commanded shadows and fear. The pacts multiplied rapidly as mortal demand for quick magical power exceeded supply of traditional wizarding education. The warlock tradition fundamentally changed relationships between the Feywild and material plane. Thousands of mortals became directly bound to Archfey patrons, creating networks of influence that crossed planar boundaries. The Archfey gained eyes and hands in material plane kingdoms, able to advance their interests through mortal agents. The warlocks themselves existed between worlds, drawing power from the Feywild while living in mortal reality. They became bridges and intermediaries, neither fully mortal nor truly Fey. Baba Yaga established her tradition of claiming firstborn children and true names during this era of increasing mortal contact. She recognized that desperate parents made the most reliable sources of valuable payment. A couple facing a childless marriage would promise anything for fertility. A mother whose child suffered terminal illness would sacrifice everything for a cure. Baba Yaga offered solutions to problems beyond mortal magic's reach, but her prices reflected the true value of what she provided. The firstborn tradition began when a merchant named Gregorius sought Baba Yaga's help to conceive an heir. She granted his wish but demanded his firstborn child as payment, to be delivered on the child's 7th birthday. Gregorius agreed, believing he could find a way to escape the bargain before payment came due. He could not. On his daughter's 7th birthday, Baba Yaga appeared at his door and claimed what she was owed. The child vanished into the dancing hut and was never seen again. Baba Yaga raised the stolen children according to her own peculiar methods. She taught them magic that blended material plane tradition with Feywild chaos. She trained them in crafts and skills she considered valuable. She used them as servants and agents for tasks requiring subtlety or innocence. Some of the stolen children eventually earned their freedom and returned to mortal society as powerful individuals in their own right. Others remained with Baba Yaga permanently, becoming extensions of her will scattered across multiple planes. The true name tradition proved even more insidious. Baba Yaga discovered that knowing a being's true name granted significant power over them, allowing magical compulsion that could not be resisted. She began demanding true names as payment for minor services, creating a collection of bound individuals who could be called upon whenever she needed something accomplished. The bound victims often failed to realize the full implications until Baba Yaga invoked her control, forcing them to act against their own interests or values. Bloodlines bound to Baba Yaga spread across dozens of material plane kingdoms. Children born from unions she arranged or blessed carried her mark genetically, manifesting unusual abilities and strange compulsions. These bloodlines provided constant streams of potential servants who found themselves drawn to her service through hereditary obligation. Baba Yaga was building an empire through accumulated debts rather than conquered territory, achieving influence that would outlast any conventional power structure. The Druid circles formalized their connection to the Feywild by establishing sacred groves that existed simultaneously in both planes. The Druids had always drawn power from nature itself, but they discovered that nature, in the Feywild, expressed itself with far greater intensity than material plane equivalents. A grove that existed partially in the Feywild could channel that enhanced natural energy, granting Druids access to abilities impossible through purely material plane sources. The first dual-plane grove was established in what is now the Sword Coast by an archdruid named Sylvanus the Elder. He selected a location where planar boundaries were naturally thin and spent 3 years working ritual magic to anchor the grove permanently in both worlds. The result exceeded his expectations. Trees in the grove grew to impossible heights. Plants bloomed year-round regardless of season. Animals that dwelled there gained unusual intelligence and longevity. The grove became a place of power that attracted druids from hundreds of miles away. Other circles replicated Sylvanus's success across multiple continents. They created networks of sacred groves that served as anchor points between planes, locations where druids could reliably cross into the Feywild or channel its power into material plane magic. The groves also attracted Fey creatures who appreciated the familiar environment and settled nearby, creating communities where mortals and Fey lived in close proximity. These mixed settlements became important cultural exchange points where knowledge and traditions flowed freely between worlds. Power flowed both ways. Titania granted the first Great Hunt Charter to a material plane knight named Cornelius Hark, who had impressed her through demonstrations of courage and honorable conduct. The charter authorized Hark to pursue Fey criminals across both planes, granting him legal authority in Summercourt territories and magical protections that would keep him alive in the Feywild's dangerous wilderness. In exchange, Hark swore eternal service to Titania, binding his soul to her court after death. Hark became legendary in both worlds. He tracked a serial killer through 3 countries and 2 planes, finally cornering the criminal in a Feywild swamp where conventional law enforcement could never reach. He recovered stolen artifacts from Fey thieves and returned them to their rightful owners. He resolved disputes between mortal and Fey communities through fair judgment that earned respect from both sides. His reputation established the Great Hunt Charter as a position of genuine authority rather than ceremonial title. Titania issued additional charters to worthy mortals over the following centuries. Each charter holder gained supernatural tracking abilities and enhanced combat prowess in exchange for absolute loyalty to the Summer Court. They became her agents in material plane territories where she could not act directly, enforcing her interpretation of justice and advancing her political interests. The charter holders also served as recruitment tools, demonstrating to ambitious mortals that loyal service to the Fey could grant power and prestige beyond what mortal institutions offered. The Gloaming Court developed its own networks of mortal servants through corruption rather than formal agreements. Unseelie agents discovered they could transform mortal worshippers into Shadow Fae through prolonged exposure to Shadowfell energies channeled through the Feywild. The transformation destroyed most of the victim's original personality, but granted enhanced abilities and fanatical loyalty to the Queen of Air and Darkness. These Shadow Fae infiltrated material plane kingdoms as spies and saboteurs, creating intelligence networks that gave the Gloaming Court detailed information about mortal political dynamics. The Shadow Fae proved devastatingly effective at their assigned tasks. They could pass as normal mortals, while possessing abilities no natural human could match. They operated in cells that knew nothing about each other, preventing compromise of entire networks if individual agents were captured. They reported directly to Gloaming Court handlers through magical communication that left no physical evidence. They represented a level of organized espionage that most material plane kingdoms were completely unprepared to counter. The Green Lords observed increasing mortal traffic through their territories with growing alarm. They had tolerated occasional travelers and even welcomed druids who showed proper respect for natural order. But the volume of mortal incursions was increasing exponentially as more kingdoms discovered reliable methods for reaching the Feywild. The Green Lords recognized that unrestricted mortal access would eventually damage the primeval forests they had protected since the plane's formation. The eldest Green Lords gathered in conclave and decided to establish formal relationships with mortal druid circles rather than continuing to deal with mortals individually. They offered the Oath of Ancient Green, a binding agreement between Green Lord authority and organized druidic religion. Under the oath's terms, druids could freely access green territories and draw upon their enhanced natural power. In exchange, druids swore to protect natural places in both planes and to regulate mortal access to the Feywild through their sacred groves. The Oath of Ancient Green created the first formal alliance between Fey powers and mortal religious orders. It gave druids institutional backing from beings powerful enough to threaten Archfey, while providing the Green Lords with distributed enforcement of their environmental protection policies. The arrangement proved remarkably durable, surviving political upheavals and planar catastrophes that destroyed less carefully structured alliances. A cabal of human archwizards attempted to conquer portions of the Feywild during the final centuries of Netheryl's existence. They had studied the plane for generations and believed they understood its fundamental principles well enough to impose their own order upon its chaos. They opened massive gates and sent armies of bound outsiders and constructed golems into Feywild territories, intending to claim land and subjugate native populations through overwhelming magical force. The Archwizards made a catastrophic error. They drew power for their conquest from the Far Realm, a dimension of alien madness that existed beyond normal planar boundaries. They believed Far Realm energy would be more effective against Fey targets than conventional magic. They were correct about effectiveness, but failed to anticipate consequences. The Far Realm energies corrupted everything they touched, twisting Fey creatures into monstrous forms and poisoning land until it became uninhabitable. The Nightshade Grotto transformed from a beautiful valley into a zone of horror over the course of weeks. Fey creatures exposed to Far Realm corruption mutated into Fomorians, massive beings with grotesque features and shattered minds. The land itself became cancerous, growing tumors of crystallized madness that spread like infection. The Archwizards lost control of their invasion force as corrupted Fey turned on their masters and slaughtered the human commanders. The conquest collapsed into chaos that threatened to spread across the entire Feywild. The Archfey united to contain the corruption before it could spread beyond the Nightshade Grotto. They established quarantine barriers using magic drawn from multiple courts and factions, cooperating despite their usual hostility because Far Realm corruption threatened everyone equally. They succeeded in containing the infection but could not cure it. The Nightshade Grotto remained permanently tainted, a scar on the Feywild that served as monument to mortal hubris and a warning against using powers beyond mortal comprehension. The Archfey collectively established the law of names and bargains in response to increasing mortal interaction. The law operated as a fundamental magical principle rather than legislation requiring enforcement. Any bargain made between Fey and mortal became binding at a level that transcended individual will, enforced by the Feywild itself rather than any court or institution. Breaking such a bargain resulted in automatic magical consequences that could not be avoided or appealed. The law protected both parties equally. A mortal who agreed to serve an archfey for 7 years found themselves magically compelled to fulfill that service, unable to break their word even if they desperately wanted to escape. But the archfey who promised payment or reward for that service was equally bound, forced to honor their agreement regardless of changing circumstances or desires. The law made every word spoken in negotiation potentially binding, creating an environment where careful phrasing and precise language became essential survival skills. Mortal legends from this era filtered back to material plane kingdoms and established the Feywild's reputation among common people. Parents told children stories about Fey who stole names and trapped the unwary in eternal service. Bards sang ballads about heroes who outwitted archfey through clever wordplay or escaped Fey captivity through exploiting loopholes in their agreements. The stories emphasized danger and beauty in equal measure, establishing the Feywild as a place where wonders waited but at prices that might prove too high to pay. The age of isolation was ending permanently, replaced by something far more complicated: integration. Reality shattered across the material plane in the year mortals would remember as 1385 Dale Reckoning. The spell plague erupted when the goddess Mystra died, and the weave that structured all magic collapsed into chaos. The catastrophe sent shockwaves through every plane connected to the material world, but nowhere felt the impact more dramatically than the Feywild. The boundaries between planes, already thin in many locations, dissolved entirely in others. Forests from the Feywild manifested in material kingdoms. Mortal cities found themselves surrounded by impossible wilderness that operated according to Fey logic rather than natural law. The planar merger occurred without warning or pattern. A village in Cormyr went to sleep in familiar farmland and woke surrounded by trees that whispered in voices no mortal language could express. A section of Waterdeep's docks found itself overlapping with a Feywild marsh where time flowed backward and fish swam through air. An entire Symbian city phased partially into the Feywild, its eastern half remaining in the material plane while its western districts existed in eternal twilight filled with pixies and treants. The transformations struck randomly, affecting some regions catastrophically while leaving neighboring territories completely untouched. The initial chaos killed thousands outright. Mortals found themselves breathing air saturated with magic their bodies could not process. They aged decades in hours or regressed to childhood in minutes. They transformed into animals or plants without understanding what was happening to them. The Feywild's reality-warping properties proved lethal to beings evolved for material plane consistency. Those who survived the first days did so through luck or latent magical resistance that even they did not know they possessed. The Archfey struggled to maintain their domains as the fundamental nature of planar boundaries shifted. Titania watched helplessly as portions of her summer court territories merged with material plane kingdoms, subjecting her lands to mortal political disputes and military conflicts. She dispatched agents to assess the damage and discovered that the merger was not temporary distortion but genuine fusion. Her forests now existed in both planes simultaneously, subject to laws and forces from each reality. She would need to adapt her governance to account for mortal presence she could neither prevent nor eliminate. The Queen of Air and Darkness responded to the chaos with opportunistic expansion. She recognized that the planar instability created opportunities for claiming new territories, while rivals remained distracted, managing crises in their own domains. She sent gloaming court forces into regions where the merger had created power vacuums, establishing unseelie authority before other factions could respond. She claimed forests that had previously resisted her influence and absorbed minor courts whose leaders had died or fled during the initial catastrophe. The expanded boundaries brought new forests and wild places under Titania's nominal authority, but exercising that authority proved nearly impossible. A summer court decree issued in the Feywild carried no weight in material plane territories that happened to overlap with Fey lands. Mortal kingdoms claimed sovereignty based on historical precedent that predated the merger. Titania found herself negotiating with human nobles and elven princes who viewed her as a foreign power rather than the rightful sovereign of territories they occupied. The situation forced her to develop diplomatic skills she had never needed when the Feywild existed in isolation. The Gloaming Court nearly collapsed during the Spell Plague when the Queen of Air and Darkness vanished without explanation or warning. She was present in her palace one moment and simply gone the next, leaving no trace of where she had traveled or whether she had departed voluntarily. Her disappearance created an immediate succession crisis as various unseelie nobles claimed authority to rule in her absence. The court fractured into competing factions that fought shadow wars while officially maintaining unity. The power vacuum persisted for 17 years. Gloaming Court territories descended into chaos as ambitious nobles carved out personal fiefdoms and refused to acknowledge any central authority. Trade collapsed. Diplomatic relationships deteriorated. Lesser Fey fled to neutral territories or sought protection from other courts. The unseelie forces that had been expanding aggressively under the Queen's direction found themselves without coordination or strategic vision, allowing Summer Court to reclaim much of what had been recently lost. Rival theories emerged attempting to explain the Queen's disappearance. Some believed she had been killed by an unknown enemy and her body hidden to prevent discovery. Others argued she had voluntarily departed to the Shadowfell to gain power from that plane's increased prominence during the Spell Plague. A third faction insisted she had been captured by entities from the Far Realm who sought revenge for the Gloaming Court's role in containing the Nightshade Grotto corruption. No theory could be proven or disproven without the Queen herself to confirm what had occurred. The succession struggle produced three primary claimants to Gloaming Court leadership. The Prince of Frost argued that his power rivaled the Queen's own, and the court required strong leadership only he could provide. A shadow dragon, named Urishtar, claimed the Queen had designated him as heir before her disappearance, though he could produce no evidence supporting his assertion. A cabal of unseelie archfey collectively declared themselves a ruling council that would govern until the Queen returned or her fate was definitively established. The internal conflict prevented the Gloaming Court from capitalizing on opportunities the Spell Plague created. While Summer Court adapted to new realities and expanded influence in merged territories, the unseelie forces turned inward and consumed themselves through factional warfare. Lesser courts that had maintained unseelie allegiance switched to seelie or declared neutrality, recognizing that the Gloaming Court could no longer protect them. The Queen's absence cost her court decades of political progress and territorial gains. Everything changed when she returned. The Prince of Frost exploited the planar chaos to expand his frozen realm by an unprecedented 70%. The Spell Plague's disruption of normal magical flows allowed him to extend winter's reach into territories that had previously resisted through natural warmth or magical defenses. He flash froze entire forests and transformed temperate valleys into Arctic wastelands. He claimed portions of the material plane that merged with the Feywild, establishing ice palaces in mountain ranges that had never known permanent winter. The prince's expansion brought him into direct conflict with mortal kingdoms unprepared for Fey aggression. A coalition of northern realms discovered their territories were being systematically frozen by an entity they could neither negotiate with nor effectively fight. Their armies froze solid when they attempted military response. Their diplomats went mad from exposure to the prince's grief-maddened presence. They found themselves facing an enemy who possessed power beyond anything mortal magic could counter, and motivations no human psychology could comprehend. The expansion also violated territories claimed by other archfey who had been too distracted by their own crises to immediately respond. Titania woke to discover that several of her border forests had been transformed into frozen wastelands. The Green Lords found ancient groves killed by supernatural cold that should never have penetrated their protections. Even the Gloaming Court, despite its internal chaos, recognized that the Prince of Frost had violated the territorial boundaries established through centuries of negotiation. The prince claimed his expansion was legitimate reclamation of lands that had always rightfully belonged to Winter. He argued that the spell plague had dissolved all previous territorial agreements and allowed renegotiation of boundaries through demonstration of power. He declared he would continue expanding until he controlled all lands where winter naturally occurred, a claim that encompassed vast territories across multiple planes. His pronouncements made clear that negotiation was impossible. He would take what he wanted and destroy anyone who attempted to stop him. Mortal kingdoms that found themselves partially in the Feywild faced impossible choices. Some attempted to resist the merger and recreate their original material plane existence through massive ritual magic. These efforts universally failed and often made situations worse by destabilizing already fragile planar boundaries. Other kingdoms embraced the transformation and adapted their cultures to incorporate Fey elements, teaching their populations how to navigate the dangers of existing between worlds. A human city called Gloomwrought became the most successful example of adaptation. The city had existed in a region where planar boundaries were naturally unstable and slipped entirely into the Feywild during the spell plague. Rather than fight the transformation, Gloomwrough's leaders established diplomatic relationships with nearby Fey powers and restructured their government to account for Fey law. They taught citizens how to avoid making binding bargains accidentally and established protocols for safely interacting with Fey creatures. Within a generation, Gloomwrought had become a prosperous trading hub that connected mortal and Fey economies. Other settlements were less fortunate. A Cormyrian town found itself overlapping with a wild hunt path and suffered regular casualties as supernatural hunters pursued their quarry through populated streets. A Sembian village merged with a territory claimed by hostile Fey who viewed human presence as an invasion requiring violent response. An entire province of Thay phased randomly between material plane and Feywild, spending unpredictable periods in each location and making stable governance impossible. The Raven Queen extended her influence from the Shadowfell into portions of the Feywild during this era of chaos and territorial reorganization. She was a goddess of death who claimed dominion over souls and memories, and the spell plague had granted her opportunities to expand beyond her traditional domain. She discovered that some territories existed simultaneously in the Feywild, Shadowfell, and material plane, creating three-way overlap zones where her authority could be established without directly challenging Fey powers. The Raven Queen established dark temples in these overlap zones and began claiming souls of those who died within their boundaries. She argued that death transcended planar politics and she possessed rightful authority over the deceased regardless of where they died. The Archfey contested her claim, insisting that beings who died in Feywild territories belonged to Fey powers rather than death gods. The dispute created theological and magical conflicts that could not be resolved through existing frameworks. Titania eventually negotiated a compromise with the Raven Queen that established precedents for managing multiplanar overlap zones. The agreement specified that souls of Fey creatures always belonged to the Feywild, regardless of where death occurred, while souls of mortals went to the Raven Queen unless they had made specific bargains with Fey powers before death. The compromise satisfied neither party completely, but prevented open conflict that would have damaged both realms. The Raven Queen's temples in the Feywild became significant political factors. They provided neutral ground where different factions could interact without triggering territorial disputes. They offered services like memory, storage, and soul protection that proved valuable to Fey and mortals alike. They demonstrated that powers from other planes could establish permanent presence in the Feywild if they provided sufficient value to offset territorial concerns from the Archfey. The planar boundaries eventually restabilized, but in configurations that differed dramatically from pre-spell plague arrangements. Some territories that had merged with the Feywild returned to purely material, plane existence. Others remained permanently in the Fey realm, their mortal populations transformed into something between human and Fey over generations of exposure. A third category achieved stable overlap, existing in both planes simultaneously and accessible from either side. The restabilization occurred gradually over decades, rather than suddenly. Regions would flicker between planes with decreasing frequency until they finally settled into permanent configurations. The process was unpredictable and traumatic, with populations never certain whether they would wake in the material plane or Feywild on any given morning. Governments struggled to maintain authority over territories that might be physically present one day and completely inaccessible the next. The Archfey adapted to the new reality with varying degrees of success. Titania embraced the changes and incorporated merged territories into her court structure, treating mortal populations as legitimate subjects deserving protection and governance. The Queen of Air and Darkness, upon her return, took a more exploitative approach and used merged territories as sources of mortal servants and tribute. The Prince of Frost ignored the political implications entirely and continued attempting to freeze everything within his reach. The Green Lords proved most resistant to adaptation. They viewed the planar merger as violation of natural order and attempted to purge mortal influence from territories under their protection. They killed or drove out human settlers who had established communities in merged forests. They destroyed cities that overlapped with green domains. They made clear through violence that they would not tolerate permanent mortal presence in their sacred groves, regardless of how planar boundaries had shifted. New Fey creatures emerged from the planar chaos, born from magical saturation that exceeded even the Feywild's normal abundance. The Hags of Desolation manifested in blighted lands, where the merger had gone particularly wrong, regions poisoned by conflicting magical laws from multiple planes. These hags possessed powers that blended Feywild chaos with material plane corruption, making them far more dangerous than traditional hag varieties. They claimed the blighted lands as sovereign territories and began building their own twisted kingdoms. The Eladrin cities that had existed in stable Feywild territories suddenly found themselves facing existential decisions. Some cities, like Astrazalian, adapted to the new planar configurations by adjusting their phasing patterns to account for changed boundaries. Others discovered that the merger had trapped them permanently in one plane or the other, ending their traditional dual existence. The city of Mithrandain, already damaged from Gloaming Court occupation, found itself permanently fixed in the Feywild, with all material plane connections severed. The Eladrin who had returned to the material plane during the Great Exodus faced their own crisis. The territories they had settled were now partially or fully merged with the Feywild, exposing them to the very transformative energies they had fled. Some embraced the irony and allowed themselves to transform back into true Eladrin, completing a cycle that had taken millennia. Others fought desperately to maintain their hard-won mortality, using powerful magic to shield themselves from Fey influence. The spell plague fundamentally altered the relationship between the Feywild and material plane. The realms could no longer be understood as separate dimensions connected by thin places and rare gates. They were now intertwined in complex configurations that defied traditional planar theory. Scholars developed new models attempting to explain how overlap zones functioned and what rules governed planar boundaries in the post-Spellplague reality. Their theories remained incomplete and contradictory, unable to fully account for what they observed. The age of separation was ending completely, replaced by something unprecedented in cosmic history: fusion.